There we go. Hey everyone, welcome to Data Umbrella's webinar. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then Joe will do his talk, and we will, if you want to ask questions, just ask in the chat and we'll answer it after every section. This is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube within a couple of days. Data Umbrella is a community for underrepresented persons in data science, and we are a nonprofit organization. This is our team of volunteers that help Data Umbrella run. We have a code of conduct, and we want to thank you for helping make this a welcoming, friendly, professional community for all, and this applies to our chat as well. There are various ways to support Data Umbrella. The first and foremost is to follow our code of conduct. The second is, one of the ways is that we have a Discord server, and the link to the Discord server is on our website, and that's where you can ask and answer questions and share events and jobs. Another way to support Data Umbrella is to donate to our nonprofit. We are an open collective as Data Umbrella, and many companies use a platform called Benevity, which means that if you make a donation, your company will match it $1 for $1, and that's another way to support Data Umbrella as an open collective. We have quite a large library of videos, about 70 videos now on Data Umbrella YouTube. So, subscribe to our channel, and today's webinar is going to be on our YouTube as well. We have a lot of playlists as well on our YouTube. One of them is career advice. We have PyMC and NumPy series, as well as contributing to open source. So check them out. We have a monthly newsletter, which is at dataumbrella.substack.com. We send a newsletter out once a month. We promise not to spam you or to sell your email address, but if you want to find out what's happening with Data Umbrella, that's a good place to get, just one communication a month. Our website has a lot of resources on conferences, open source, accessibility, and responsibility. We encourage you to check it out. We're on all social media platforms as Data Umbrella. The ones that are highlighted here, Twitter and LinkedIn is where we are most active. Meetup is the place to go to find out about upcoming events. YouTube is where our videos are, and we have a blog as well, blog.dataumbrella.org. This platform is called Big Marker, and it has live captioning. So if you go to the very top, there is CC, which means closed captioning. And so, I hear English is the best language for closed captioning. So if you would like to enable that, please do. We do timestamps for all of our videos, and I'll share the link to this issue. So if you're interested in doing timestamps for this video, it helps people, find where they want to go to the video as a reference, and it helps potential viewers find it based on search terms. So if you'd like to contribute to that, I'll share the link. We have August is a busy month for us. So we've had an event every week. And so next Tuesday, August 23rd, we have software engineering for probabilistic programming. And the Tuesday after that, which is August 30th, we have software testing and open source and data science. And these are these promise to be like really great events. I've been looking for a speaker for months, so I'm happy to finally find speakers on these topics. I think they're really, really relevant to people who are doing the work in our space. Today's talk is Intro to Front-End Development with React with Joe. I'm going to let Joe say his last name because I'm not sure exactly how to say it. Joe
Torreggiani.
Torreggiani. Joe is a technologist, educator, and advocate for environmental and social justice with over a decade of experience as a software engineer and leader working at impact-focused organizations. He has a BA in history from the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York, which is upstate New York. He graduated from General Assembly's Web Development Bootcamp. He is currently a software engineer at Square and co-founder of a open collective nonprofit called Sustainable Progress and Equity Collective, also known as SPEC. And that is actually an organization with whom Data Umbrella is collaborating with. And he serves as a board member for Open Food Network USA. And if you'd like to, share about this event, our Twitter handle is @DataUmbrella. You can find Joe on Twitter at capital JOE, and the last name is TORREGGIANI. And with that, I am going to turn off my microphone and camera and hand it over to Joe.
Thanks so much for that introduction. So I'm going to just share my screen here, and hopefully this will work okay. So I think we have our screen sharing. Great. And I'm going to put this into slideshow mode. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming here today to talk a little bit about front-end development with React. And so Rashima already gave a pretty good background about me, but just a little bit more context about my technical background. I've worked with a bunch of different technologies over the last 10 years, including Ruby on Rails, Django, Sinatra, React, Ember, and a bunch of others. I've worked on both web applications and mobile applications, and I've worked at a variety of companies right now, working at Square. And like was already mentioned, I'm also co-founder at Sustainable Progress and Equality Collective, where we do a lot of software engineering mentorship, career coaching and tutoring, and teaching things like React. And so we're all here because we're interested in learning React. So what is React? React is a free and open source JavaScript library for building interfaces. This is primarily the UI, the user interface components of applications that you're seeing. In the context is generally web development, although there are React tools that also allow you to build user interfaces for mobile applications as well. React is used by a ton of companies across the world. These are just a couple of the big ones that use it. And it's commonly ranked as one of the most popular and productive JavaScript libraries for front-end web development, with 11.1 million developers using React reported on GitHub, and countless more outside of that ecosystem. And so before we move on, and we're going to revisit this and talk more and more about this, we're going to talk a lot about languages, frameworks, and libraries. And many of these terms can be a little confusing, and sometimes they're used interchangeable. So I'm going to give a little bit of context and also kind of provide some context on where React fits in this kind of broader ecosystem, and why it's so popular and why so many people are using it. And so when we're talking about languages, typically we have the front end that is JavaScript. And so the main reason why you only hear JavaScript when we're talking about the front end is that that's really the only language that allows dynamic behavior implemented in browsers. So all of your major browsers like Chrome, Mozilla, Edge, or Internet Explorer, they all support JavaScript to run in the browser, including right now, JavaScript is probably running for this particular application we're using. But you'll also hear Node.js, and we'll talk more about Node, but Node allows JavaScript to not just run in the browser, but also run on a computer, similar to other programming languages like Python and Ruby that you might be more familiar with. And so all of the libraries and frameworks that we're going to discuss are all going to be based on one of these languages, including a bunch of external packages that typically fall in the kind of libraries category. So you have a library, for example, is React.js. Another one is D3, which is used for rendering like 3D models. In Python, it might be something like Pandas or Jinja 2. Jinja 2 is a templating language that allows you to actually generate HTML, but it's specifically just for that one thing. It's kind of a focused library. And similarly, in Ruby, something like Active Record, that's a library specifically for modeling relationships with the database. So they have very specific purposes, and they're kind of isolated. When you get to a framework tends to take multiple libraries together and also organize the code in a way that makes it really easy for you to quickly scaffold or build an application. So when we talk about backend frameworks, and later on we'll talk more about the distinction between backend and front end. But for now, you can think of the backend as like the parts that you don't see that are talking to a database or talking to a service like, a separate API, application programming interface, which basically is a way for you to talk to a service like Twitter or, PayPal, any kind of service that you're trying to integrate with. And so in the JavaScript world, a backend framework would run using Node.js is something like Express or Sales.js. In Python, Django and Flask are popular, and Ruby on Rails and Sinatra. These are all backend frameworks. And then in front-end frameworks, you tend to be talking about additional JavaScript. Almost entirely, it's going to be a JavaScript-based framework. For example, Next.js builds upon React.js. Vue is similar to React, but has more functionality. It could be argued that Vue and Angular are more libraries because there are frameworks that are built on top of them, like Nux.js is for Vue.js. I also just dropped these to mention that there are actually attempts to generate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we'll talk more about those specific outputs in the presentation. But there are attempts to do this in Python or Ruby, but they're much less popular. And one other thing to jump here. Let me, I think I actually lost this link here. Here we go. I think, can you see, did it switch for me? Let's see here.
I see the slides that says languages at the top, JavaScript and Node.js, and then Python.
Okay, yeah, I think because it's not letting me share my my other page here. I think because I'm doing the window. So I'm just going to quickly stop sharing and share entire screen. Can you see this presentation now on this other tab?
Yes, I see it's the Stack Overflow, right?
Yes. Yep. So I wanted to just kind of point out when we're talking about this. This is a great survey from Stack Overflow and talking about kind of popularity of different types of frameworks and languages. And you can see on the top of the list is Node.js. We'll talk about this more as well, but Node.js is really used in most of these other JavaScript-based packages. And so it's really core, and it makes sense it's on the top of the list. And then the very next one is React.js. It's just overwhelmingly popular for the purpose that it's been designed. So that's kind of a reason why we might want to spend some time in looking at React. And so with that, we can kind of move on. We're going to quickly just talk about the presentation. We'll talk a little bit about open source licensing, the foundations of web development libraries and frameworks. We'll get into the fundamentals of React. And then finally, we'll be looking at building a very tiny application in React. And so quickly, just about React's licensing. One of the benefits of using React is its licensing. React was created in 2011, or rather was first used in production at Facebook. And it was created by Jordan Walk. And it's went into use in 2012 at Instagram. And it was open sourced and now is used by over 1,500 open source contributors on GitHub. Or it's being built by 1,500 contributors, but it's being used widely across the world. And this is because of its licensing. And so it was open sourced in 2013 under and it's under an MIT license, which really means that it can be used for most purposes, both commercial and non-commercial, which means it's okay for you to go pick it up and start using it for whatever purpose you want. And so with that means we can start talking about doing the work of front-end development. And so just to call out that I did do another presentation about Django. And in that presentation, I go into a deeper explanation of some of the concepts we're going to be going over here, particularly in the back end. So definitely check out that part of the presentation if you want to go deeper on the back end side of things. But for this presentation, we're going to be mainly focused on the front end. And so for front end concepts, we're going to cover the client server model, HyperText transfer protocol, the foundational languages that are used on the front end, as well as quickly talk about server-side applications and go into single-page applications, and then we'll move into web development frameworks. And so when we're talking about client-server model and front-end and back-end, really what this means is that you have a computer somewhere, and it's going to be communicated with what we call clients. And in most cases, the client on here in the left is going to be a web browser or a mobile application or some type of device. And the server is probably going to be running in the cloud somewhere, like Amazon Web Services or DigitalOcean, that's running some type of backend application. And so your application that we're going to be building, front end and back end, it's going to be bridging the gap between these two services. And so this is kind of a simplified visualization of this, right? You have some server or server farm here. There's a bunch of complicated stuff that happens in between that is enabled by the internet, and then you have your clients. And so if we come back to this, when we're looking at the technologies of how they map, we can see here we have React.js, and we have the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which we'll talk about more, and as well as your browsers and your clients. And then these are all the kind of back-end technologies, which we won't really dig into too much today. And then the last piece is this TCP/IP, which is the transmission protocol that really allows these two separate services to communicate. We won't really dig into that, but it is a very deep area that's really critical to this whole client-server model working. Out of that TCP/IP protocol, the one that we're really going to be mainly worrying about for this presentation is called the HyperText transfer protocol. And that is basically the way that we define communicating between web servers and web clients. And really what HTTP enables us to do is use technologies like HTML. And so HTML, if you're not super familiar with it, is really the foundational structure of any web application. At the end of the day, whatever your backend is sending, or even if you have a JavaScript framework that's generating HTML, HTML is the thing that your browser is going to use to structure the content of your application. And we'll look at an example of what HTML looks like, but in general, this is kind of the foundational structure. Then you have CSS, which it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And CSS works in tandem with HTML in order to actually add style. It adds flexibility, and it enables us to separate the visual presentation from the structural components of the application. And that will include colors and fonts and images and layout. And you're able to actually pull these out into separate files that we'll see in a second. And then finally, the kind of trifecta of the three technologies that we're going to be building on today is JavaScript, which is a high-level general-purpose programming language that conforms to the ECMAScript, which is really a standard that is defined by all the companies and organizations come together to work in a standards protocol that all the browsers will implement JavaScript in the same way. In practice, there's sometimes are small variations between how a Chrome or a Mozilla might interpret JavaScript, but they've been very, for the most part, standardized. JavaScript has dynamic typing, it's got object orientation, and it's multi-paradigm, so you can do all kinds of different types of programming in it. And really, it's like the core technology that makes anything that's really dynamic work. Like 97% of websites are going to use JavaScript in some form or fashion, so you can't really get away from it. And the last bit about JavaScript is when we're talking about how it interacts with HTML and CSS, one of the core things that we'll hear about is what's called the document object model, which is a way that HTML and CSS is going to be modeled that allows JavaScript an easy way to access those individual components in the document and do things like manipulate it, like changing a style or adding something to the document. And this is after the page has loaded. And so before we kind of put it all together, I'll just mention that the HTTP protocol doesn't just communicate by sending HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, There are other types of data interchange formats. Popular ones are called JSON, which stands for JavaScript object notation, because it looks basically like objects written in JavaScript, as well as XML, which you have an example here, which is also similar to HTML in its structure. And so if you put that all together, in the case of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you'll get something like this. This is the very tiniest example where you have HTML tags, and you can identify them by the open bracket, which has multiple types of properties. And in this case, this is an HTML tag. Actually, the name itself is called HTML, and it tends to delimit the beginning and the end of a document. And then you have other types of tags. And so we're not going to go through an exhaustive list of every HTML tag, but there is a kind of list of different keywords. So you have head. Head tends to include information like metadata and a title. And then you can see here, I'm embedding a style tag. And in that style tag, I've written some CSS. So this is actually two languages. One is embedded in the other. Here, I'm specifying that I want to highlight the H1 tag in my document and color it red, make it bold. And then I can see here that I have an H1 tag. So here, the output will actually make this text red. I've defined a button. I've also defined a script. And here I have a snippet of JavaScript. And so we'll go into the JavaScript component. But here you can get an idea that when we talked about the document object model, this is how you do it in practice. I do document, query selector, button, which is basically saying find this button in the document. And then on click means when I click it, do something. And in this case, I'm going to tell the window to open an alert. And so that's a lot just in that tiny snippet of code. But what this is combined will output into an actual document that gives you some functionality. In practice, you tend to not want to do what that previous code had, where you had a bunch of code all embedded. So you'll see something like this, where you can actually link separate styles or have a separate file for your JavaScript. And so this is a little bit more, it helps you separate out your bits of logic and code. And so that's really how all of these technologies come together. In any project that you're working on, it doesn't matter what framework you're using, Django, React, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it will spit out some form of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which the browser will interpret. So all the frameworks and libraries are ultimately trying to make it easier for us to not have to manually do as much of what we just talked about here. And so I think actually before I go into JavaScript, if there's any immediate questions, I'm happy to answer them before we go a little deeper on JavaScript. I'm not sure if Reshma, if there's any questions so far.
No questions so far.
Okay, great. So we can move on.